My friends, in thinking about our gospel story today, the question that came to my mind repeatedly as I read it was, who is Jesus? Both for the men and women in this story and for us today. Who is Jesus? And I've been asking myself that question a lot over this last week in reading this story and our gathering at General Synod. I've also had numerous conversations with people from all over the country, like I said earlier, literally from all over the world, keeping that same question in mind. Now, the easy answer for us is that Jesus is the great healer, that Jesus is the teacher, that Jesus is the embodiment of kindness, the embodiment of love. The easy answer for us is that Jesus is the light of the world. Now, but Jesus is also the one who points out our sin. Jesus is also the one who tells us our need to repent. Jesus is the one who flipped over the tables in the temple. Jesus is the one who begged in prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane that he not have to go through the crucifixion. Father, take this cup from me. Jesus is and was and will be all of these things. Both then and now. Both yesterday and today. So I ask us, who is Jesus? My friends, will you pray with me? Oh, merciful Christ, our Prince of Peace, our sometimes angry God, we ask to feel your presence among us in this moment and in all of our lives, inspiring us to do more, pushing us forward to preach and teach and spread your gospel witness. And we give you thanks for your continued presence among us as we are gathered here in community this day. May the words of my mouth and the meditation of each and every heart be acceptable to you, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. So the Inquisition, this is a system, basically an institutional system of religious trials and courts that was set up by the Roman Catholic Church. Now the intent of these trials and courts was to cleanse church, and at that time church meant society, of sin, of heresy, to get rid of all of this. Now, often when we think of the Inquisition, we usually only think about the Spanish Inquisition because it was much more violent and because of that much more well known. But the Inquisition trials and courts were instituted all throughout Christian Europe, the entire continent. Now, the Inquisition, of course, was an awful time in European history, to say the least. Thousands of people were terrorized and mutilated, tortured, executed. They were silenced for heresy because they believed in something or acted in some way that church authorities said was wrong. Now again, sometimes we only associate this with the Middle Ages as well, but the Inquisition trials lasted for right at 500 years. They're a very long time in history. And they only actually ended about 160, 170 years ago, in the mid-1800s. Now during this time, there were massive changes to European society. Of course, there's the invention of the printing press. There was the Protestant Reformations, the Renaissance, the Age of Enlightenment. And throughout all of these changes, the Inquisition trials were still going on. The church was stagnant even as society was moving forward. Now, the Age of Enlightenment is also called the Age of Reason, which is something we in the United Church of Christ embrace, right? Our reason. God gave us our reason. Now, during the 18th century, many intellectuals in Europe began to reject many of the old ways, a lot of the old things that were done. They sought to elevate reason over superstition. Now, in fact, while all of this going on, this was really the beginning of European history and Western history, which is part of our own, toward the modern era. And the embrace of this reason was in direct correlation to all the religious-based violence that had happened for hundreds of years. Now, the new ideas that arose during this time made their way to North America, made their way to men and women from whom we know. They helped inspire the American Revolution. These ideas were the beginning of separation of church and state, which even as religious people in a multicultural environment is something that we value. Now, these ideas led masses of people to begin to embrace scientific knowledge as a gift from God and not something that we need to fear. Now, from the search of fact-based knowledge, in the midst of this came the search for the historical Jesus. This was a scholarly quest, a theological quest, to find out who Jesus was. And not Jesus, the Son of God, not Jesus, the miracle worker, not Jesus, the one who sent the demons into the swine. Not Jesus, not that Jesus, not the one who ascended into heaven and was crucified, who was resurrected. This search was a search for the historical Jesus, who the man was, the man that actually walked on the earth. Who was this first century Jewish rabbi in this Roman province of Judea? Who was this guy? So this process of historical research that took well over 100 years really began to try to answer that question. Now, decades of research, of course, are poured into this topic that went well into the 1960s and the 1970s. And all of the things that they found, all of the research they uncovered, pointed to the fact that the human being, the man of Jesus, did actually exist. That he did actually preach and teach throughout the Roman province of Judea. Now, the people behind this effort, of course, were not seeking to understand the miracles and the divinity. They didn't care about Jesus' uniqueness. But even in that, they were still asking that simple question: who is Jesus? Now, this is the same question that Jesus' disciples asked repeatedly throughout the Gospels. The preface to our story today, when the wind calms, Jesus calms the storm and the winds and the seas, they're asking, who is Jesus? It's the same question that is asked by the people in the country of the Gerasenes. When Jesus sends the demons into the swine. And it's the same question that we continue to ask today. And it's the same question that we will continue to ask in the days to come. Who is Jesus? Because there's not a simple answer to that question. Now, over the last months, we've had an opportunity here at our church to talk about God's movement in our lives, and what that means, and what that feels, and how do we share that? How and where and when do we encounter God? Now, I truly believe that these are very real and very profound conversations to us personally, to our community, and for our faith, for our relationship with Jesus Christ. But in our seeking to understand this, we're not looking to see who that historical Jesus is. We want to know who that Son of God is, who that divinity is, that miracle worker. That's who we're seeking. And that's who we want to see the movement from in our everyday lives. Not to say that the man isn't important, but that God is so much more than that human flesh could ever contain. So let's look at this. Who was Jesus for the man in our story? For this man who was possessed with the demons, who was possessed with a legion of demons, right? At first, when we look at the story, it almost seems like Jesus is the tormentor. That he's tormenting the man because he commands the unclean spirit to come out of him. And of course, the demons resist because the demons don't want to, they want to have their day and they want to do their thing, whatever demons do, keep living in the man. So they're not happy about coming out, right? But it seems like Jesus is tormenting the demons then, not the man, right? But I can only imagine that even as Jesus is removing these demons from this man, whatever the demons may have been, that this must have been a painful, emotional, and spiritual experience for this man. Because we're told in our story that this is who he was for so long that he was even homeless and living out in the cemetery nude, right? So this was part of his identity. So even in that change, this had to be profoundly unsettling for him. And of course, in our story, we learn that Jesus eventually does heal the man, and the demons are displaced. But the man wants more. He wants to keep himself in the protection of Jesus. He wants to stay with Jesus. After all, in our gospel stories, particularly in the beginning of our stories, what does Jesus say? Follow me. Jesus tells disciples one by one, he calls each of them, follow me. And I will make you fishers of people, right? That's not what he's telling this man. He tells this man that I have a different path for you. I have healed you, but I've got work for you to do now. And the work that I have for you to do is to go out and be a witness to my glory, to be a witness to my work. Go out and be a witness that the Son of God has come to save. So he sends him out. Go proclaim. Go declare. And the man does just that. And we see specifically that this man recognizes the divine nature of Jesus Christ, which isn't something that a lot of people in our gospel stories do, particularly at this point in the narrative. And the way that we can understand that is because Jesus tells the man, go out. He tells him to go out and declare what God has done for you. And that recognition comes when the very next line tells us that the man goes out and tells people what Jesus had done for him. So he understands that those two are the same. Now, this is all because that this veil has been lifted from his eyes. Because this man who has been granted this new life understands who Jesus is in this moment. And in this moment, who is Jesus for that man? He is the Son of God, the healer, that Prince of Peace, that light of the world. And in the story, Jesus teaches us that we should not turn away from the demons that possess people around us. That when people in our lives are troubled, that we need to be there for them. And we see this in Jesus' example when he confronts the man with the demons in the story. He doesn't turn away from the man. He doesn't shy away from the hard work. Jesus talks to him. Jesus recognizes that the man is more than the demons which has taken over his life. That he's more than this thing inside of him. Jesus recognizes that the man is still there. That this man is longing to be set free. And Jesus does just that. Jesus sets him free to a new life. And that is the promise that Jesus makes to each of us, my friends, as well. Now, when I think back on this thousands of years of search and the answer to that question of who is Jesus, part of me feels like it's really come full circle. Because in the first search, the early search for Jesus, humanity sought to understand the uniqueness of Jesus Christ as our Messiah. We sought to understand the incarnation of God in the human flesh. Now, and though we've searched many different paths over the last 2,000 years, it seems to me that we are in that role now in our church, in our society, in our world, that we are searching for that healing, that divine love, that Jesus is the Messiah and the light of the world to lead us to new life, to a new path, to a place of wholeness. So who is Jesus? Jesus is the one who teaches us to love our neighbors and do not judge them. It is great, I think, that we know the historical man existed, but what guides us are the lessons that he taught while he lived in this life and the miraculous nature of his love for us still, even today. Because in Jesus we seek and find our God. In Jesus we seek and find our hope. And in Jesus we can seek and find new life. May it be so with us.
Let us stand and join together in number 380. The church is 1